My name is Chris Galloway. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the Executive Director at Friends of Medicare. Thank you so much for being here on this Sunday morning, the last day of this Parkland conference. So we have two great speakers to talk about public services and housing. They're both very intelligent and articulate and have a lot to offer. So first, we're going to go to Rebecca, who's talking about public services and political divisions, lessons for a deeply divided society. She's the research manager for the Parkland Institute at the U of A here at the conference we are at. Her research areas are public health care, seniors care, and public services. So we have got to work together quite a bit over the last year on public health care. She does have a doctorate in Irish politics from Queen's University, Belfast. She's had various fellowships, has written books, articles, many reports. Many of them are up on the Parkland website if you want to learn more about lab privatization, about private clinics, and some of the other healthcare issues in Alberta. Rebecca, if you want to come on up, we'll start with you.
Thank you so much, Chris. I wanted to bring a different kind of conversation into place here today, partly to bring together two of the many hats that I wear, and to start to bring together some different threads that I've been seeing across those subjects in ways that might not seem obvious, the first thought for everyone to think about. So when I was coming into this panel and working with, talking alongside Brad here to talk about housing, I was thinking about absolutely the incendiary moment of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, January 1969. Like, why is she starting here? That moment created a clash between civil rights protesters marching from Belfast to Derry to demand an end to religious discrimination in the allocation of public housing in Northern Ireland. That moment sparked a counter-protest in which the police service handed weapons to the counter-demonstrators and stood by as they beat and injured over 50 of the civil rights demonstrators, sending them to hospital. From there, the political divisions that will become an outright violent conflict on the streets of Northern Ireland for 30 years began over a question of the right to public services and equal access, equitable access to the most basic needs for our human well-being: housing, healthcare, education, and the right to vote. And in Northern Ireland at that time, this is particularly important because suffrage for local elections was based on property ownership. When I said yesterday, I was having a conversation with Sam Moore, I said, what I want to be able to do is to provoke a conversation, a little bit of a thought experiment, to take us here in this room from those first incendiary sparks of the Northern Ireland Troubles, the most sort of epitome of a deeply divided society that has evolved and emerged through those political divisions in some ways, through to the portentous collapse of public health care in Alberta, in 3 easy steps. And Sam looked at me, very kind gentleman. I was pleased to meet him yesterday. He looked at me and he said, I think you might need 4 steps for that. And I said, okay, we might need 4 steps for this. What I want to be able to do is to reframe how we think about political division in this province and what that means for our access to the vital necessities of our daily lives. In particular, the importance of understanding that political division, as it came in Northern Ireland, we think of this as a conflict between Protestants and Catholics. It's an easy shorthand. Because all of the political, social, economic, and class divisions within that society at that time became consolidated and mapped onto religious identifiers. Okay? So this is important when we start to look at the differences in Alberta, where we still have multiple different types of fractures and what happens when those become consolidated. Just to give a very, very brief and surface overview of what the conflict and the political division in Northern Ireland meant in terms of, in terms of lost lives, nearly 4,000 people killed during the 30 years of the Troubles, but many, many, many more lives disrupted in deeply traumatizing ways, and in some very mundane ways. So for example, this headline in the bottom from the Guardian, based out of Manchester, Belfast housing policy still reflects religious and economic division. That was from 2017. What you see in the center of that photo, the brick wall in the middle, is one of the over 100 peace lines, so-called peace lines, that still divides cities and communities in Northern Ireland to keep politically divided communities from physically clashing and interacting with each other. So this division of the city, geographically and politically and economically, has huge implications for how people can access these services and aspects of their daily life. For example, the center photo is from, it's called the Holy Cross dispute. Holy Cross is a Catholic elementary school in Belfast, in which these young students, as you see them running past armored Land Rovers and security personnel, had to cross through an opposing neighborhood to reach their school due to changes in those security lines. And at that time, they were pelted with rocks, they were subjected to harassment and hurled insults. Wee girls of about 6, 7, or 8. And it clashes between parents, right? That was in 2003. We can come to the final headline, in which paramedics were being offered riot gear and armed escorts in order to respond to emergency calls in certain sections of Belfast. As they're crossing through from one neighborhood into another, neighborhoods that have different political allegiances, often ambulances would be targeted with rocks or bricks, or in some cases, petrol bombs, Molotov cocktails. This becomes even more heightened if there's an actual riot underway, which between 2000 and 2020, there were plenty for various reasons. So all of this to say, these examples showing you here took place after the peace agreement was signed in 1998. Why am I bringing this up? Because this isn't Alberta, right? When I moved back to Alberta from Northern Ireland, I never imagined that any of this would be relevant to my daily life living in Edmonton or my idyllic rural life in Rocky Mountain House prior to moving here. But what I've seen over the past few years in terms of the political divisions that we're facing has sometimes these uncomfortable echoes and ways in which I think it's useful for us to reconsider how we want to overcome certain types of division in our society. What's important about this is not just the sort of starkness of the examples that I want to impress upon you, and I don't think I need to, is the ways in which political circumstances shape our opportunities for health and well-being. So a lot of you here in this room, I'm sure, are familiar with the term social determinants of health. It's become a very important concept that a lot of healthcare policy and experts, and even filtering into hospitals and clinical care, to think about the non-medical factors that influence our healthcare, our access to healthcare, our opportunities, and most importantly, these are things like socioeconomic status, education, family structures and early childhood experiences, and also race and indigenous status will impact the type of healthcare opportunities that are accessible to you and how you're treated within healthcare systems. So this is something that's become a fairly commonplace conception within our understanding of healthcare. But more important, I think, to this conversation is to ask about the political determinants of health. And this is a term that was made prominent by writer Daniel Dawes in his book of the same name. So the political determinants of health involve the systematic processes of structuring relationships, distributing resources, and administering power. operating simultaneously in ways that mutually reinforce one another to shape opportunities that are either going to advance health equity or exacerbate health inequities. So when we think about those social determinants of health, your income, your education status, right? Whether you experience systemic racism in a healthcare setting, many of those are at their root determined by political choices. So what does that mean in Alberta? And this other quote from Daniel Dawes, which is that somewhere upstream decisions were made to divert a river and benefit certain people and harm others. I've been thinking a lot about the decisions upstream that placed many of our seniors in harm's way at the beginning of this pandemic. How many years and decades of political decisions led to the conditions in our long-term care that led to thousands of Albertan seniors dying from COVID-19 in the last 2 years. You might notice this photo on the side from City of Edmonton Archives was the 1915 flood, also in which certain decisions were taken politically, where some neighborhoods would be deluged and could be sacrificed, and other people could move to higher ground. Those are political decisions. So what does this mean here in Alberta? A couple of images here about certain examples we might have seen over the summer. What it means to canvass for election while wearing a face covering, and why is that political? What does it mean to go to work at your hospital as a healthcare worker and have to fight your way through protesters hurling abuse in front of the doors of the emergency room? And what does it mean as a paramedic to have to first combat healthcare misinformation and conspiracy theories before you can administer care to a patient experiencing a healthcare emergency? I don't want to rehash some of the problems that we're experiencing here in Alberta because I think we all are deeply, deeply familiar with them. But I do want to point to the ways in which our political divisions go a lot deeper, I think, than we expect on the surface. Because I think at the outset, we often consider that our biggest battle as progressives is against, for example, those on the right, those of a conservative nature, who want to undermine and defund and privatize our public services like healthcare. You hold on to that for a minute and think about if that's the most important sort of battle line, where the division needs to be drawn in the upcoming political contest. What we can see here now, I don't know if anyone was in Jack Lucas's and Clark Bannock's talk yesterday. They've used similar screenshots here. This is Janet Brown's recent poll of important issues for Albertans. It shows your trend over time from March 2018 to October 2022. And of course, the thing that most unites Albertans in terms of their concerns politically is the state of our healthcare system. In that sense, we're not divided on the importance of providing quality healthcare for Albertans in this province. But where we are divided is on what that looks like, who that impacts, and what we do about it. For example, the crisis in staffing, the crisis in underfunding and under-resourcing of our hospitals has actually had an overwhelmingly significant impact in rural and small communities. Work that we did for the Better Way Alberta campaign with AFL showed that closures of beds and departments, particular services within those rural hospitals, amounted to 32,000 bed days lost, beds per days of a bed closed. And that number, I'm very grateful to Judith Grossman of UNA for doing the calculations on that. That includes obstetrical services, labor and delivery. 9 different communities have had 0 labor and delivery services for expectant parents in their communities. All 3 of the hospitals in Jason Nixon's riding have no obstetrical services. For example, 30 communities at its peak were experiencing closures within their hospitals due to lack of staffing, due to lack of resources, due to skyrocketing medical insurance rates and other reasons. In Sundre in particular, again, that's Jason Nixon's riding, over 18 months without the ability for their doctors to perform obstetrical services. When we talk about, going back to yesterday's session on the rural-urban divide, rural Albertans are experiencing these problems. Here's a little diagram we put together based off of reports of doctors leaving Alberta, family physicians, those operating in clinics outside of Edmonton and Calgary. Over 49 communities that lost nearly 160 doctors. There's no official collection of this data. These were people submitting their experiences to researcher Kim Seaver. And this is the map here. The larger the town name, the more doctors they've lost. This is fundamental. This is a hollowing out of absolutely essential public services. Parkland Institute is currently working on research around paramedics, EMS services. The ability for our emergency services to reach rural patients, to go through small communities. They're being dispatched more and more outside of their home locations and just under-resourced to be able to reach those. So when we think about the ways in which the constraints on our public services are falling, they don't care about those traditional divisions that we see sort of as sacrosanct within Alberta politics, rural and urban, Edmonton versus Calgary, conservative or progressive. These are impacting everyone. And similarly, in terms of education, in which students across boards are being left underfunded under these new funding formulas. Over 8,000 students across the province were entering into the school system without attached funding as they came in for their schools. Something close to 2,000 of those in Edmonton alone. But this also impacts rural schools, schools that are experiencing a shrink in their enrollment growth as well. Education workers laid off, cuts to post-secondary education, and Albertans, teachers, Albertans, parents, and students opposed to the new curriculum. But when we want to think about this in terms of political division, in terms of why this goes beyond a strict left and right, and I'm thinking in terms of something that Jared Yates Sexton said on Friday evening, which was the necessary structures for the health and well-being of the people are being starved of resources, and precisely to keep people struggling and to keep those inequitable systems and relations of power in place. So on the one hand, we can look at these situations within our province and say, this is about defunding, this is about privatization and creating profit. There's a grift at work here. And in some cases that may be true. Somebody's making money off of these private contracts, off of the labs contract, off of privatized long-term care. Somebody's making money off of this. But I think the deeper question involved here is about what it means when we start to break down these essential bonds within our communities and within our societies, our ability to access vital services, and the collectivity of care that provides the foundation of our social relationships. Mm-hmm. Part of it is that we know, and hence why I'm not up here hauling out number after number after number about the funding in long-term care, the lack of staffing in long-term care, the number of burnt-out healthcare aides and doctors and nurses and paramedics, because we know those. And I'm not up here to talk about solutions, because we know those. These researchers and experts and workers and patients and teachers and students and paramedics and doctors, they all know what needs to happen in these situations. And the question instead is about what political choices are being made to ignore that consensus, right? The consensus is about the creation of a care economy, an economy that's built around well-being, around adequate staffing and adequate physical and human resources, and an ethos of care that's collaborative instead of top-down. And that's the same for in our public education system as well. So what political choices are happening that are preventing those solutions on which there is an overwhelming consensus from being implemented? those solutions, the implementing of that is complex and involves a lot more than going to your ballot box. A really interesting case study that I want to jump to super quick to give an example of how we begin to push back on some of this. Barnet is a small council area in the suburbs of London in England. A few years ago, they were subject to the sort of like epitome of neoliberal privatization, in which essentially every function of their local council was outsourced, privatized, undercut, like everything. We're talking not just bin collection, library services, HR within the council, planning, development, regeneration, all of it. Even the financial payroll and everything for council workers was outsourced, and all to the same company. So if you called to renew your library books at Barnet Local Library, you would get a call center worker in Belfast. So that's super helpful. So they called it this like almost like EasyJet version. If anyone's ever flown EasyJet or Ryanair or similar low budget airlines, right? Where it's like, at one point, the CEO of Ryanair suggested people be charged extra to access the washrooms mid-flight, and was told that violated human rights. But this is what Barnet Council did. They voted this in for themselves under this sort of neoliberal utopia here. And instead, it all went completely wrong. No one could access any of their services. They couldn't reach a real human being who understood their area or knew what was happening. There was no accountability. Money started going missing. Planners and developers were in the same department working for the same company. They said if you paid a bonus to the planning committee, they would fast track your development permits. All sorts of absolutely rife corruption and waste. So no savings as promised, right? When you outsource, you're absolutely going to save public money. So the people of Barnet pushed back, and what they did was to start reframing situations, calling out misinformation, which is something where Parkland Institute really starts from. What are the facts on the ground? Why isn't this working? Why is this narrative of saving money and prioritizing jobs and economy over people? Why is that false and harmful? And they started creating platforms for themselves. The local media wouldn't cover it, so they started blogging about it. They started holding demonstrations in front of the local library until the point in which it became inescapable that the council had failed every person in that locality, and they weren't going to stand for it. At the next local election, all of the Tory-led Conservative Party councillors were defeated. They brought in a Labour-led council who began the slow work of unpicking these contracts and rebuilding public services from the ground up. What I want to say is that it is possible to build public services that go beyond political division. We know what the solutions are. We know that it involves putting people ahead of profits and ahead of political agendas. And we know that it involves calling out misinformation and being in control of the narrative. Those things are difficult when systems are designed to work in favor of those in power. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we begin that conversation here in Alberta to provoke a better common good for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Can we give a round of applause for sharing so much knowledge in such a short time? I love that Barnet example. We'll do questions after the second speaker. We have Brad Lafortune here to speak about housing as a human right. Now we need to act like it. I believe Brad and Emma were in a competition for who would supply their information last to Parkland. I'm not sure who won. But I like to think that's because housing, the crisis we're in, is evolving so quickly. Brad, he's the Executive Director of Public Interest Alberta. I had the pleasure of working with him when he worked for the Minister of Labour in the government, where they raised the minimum wage to $15, put in a just transition deal for co-workers, and so much other good work for workers. But with that, come on up and share your thoughts on housing.
All right. I want to talk about housing at a couple different levels. So what I'm going to try to do is just frame it up at the highest level and then bring it down to earth here in the city of Edmonton so that we can talk about our opportunities for engagement and hopefully good change. I'm an activist. I have a couple degrees in English, so I don't have a PowerPoint and I'm not an academic, but I have some ideas about how we might be able to work together to advocate for making housing a priority. Typically, Public Interest Alberta focuses on public services, public institutions, and public spaces. So our bread and butter issues are seniors care, education, the environment, post-secondary education, I see Brendan there, and a whole bunch of other issues that are really focused on public services at their core. And so when we started talking about housing a couple years ago, it was a really fruitful conversation about whether and how we might be able to make that a focus for us for the next couple of years in our strategic plan. And the reason why we landed on focusing on housing is because it's really at the core of everything. Housing is healthcare. Housing is our social ability to connect. Housing is our ability to participate in our democracy. And housing is basically a human right. So Canada has decided to declare that housing is a human right. And adequate housing has 7 components to it. I'm not going to go through the full list, but basically we have decided to agree with other countries in the world that housing is a human right, and we need to live up to that commitment. However, we are severely failing at it. Homelessness has doubled in the city of Edmonton since 2019. There are 49,000 households currently living in core housing need. Core housing need is basically that you're spending either too much on housing, more than 30% of your income, or the adequacy of your housing is not up to snuff, right? Like it's not safe for environmental reasons, or it's not accessible to services, or it's not meeting fire codes, you name it, it's not adequate housing. 49,000 households today. And according to the city of Edmonton, that's going to go to 59,000 households unless we make some major interventions. So the need is there, the declaration of housing as a human right is there, but we're not living up to it. But I think that we can make major interventions to begin to live up to that declaration. And I want to talk about how, but it's also going to mean that we have to confront some hard truths about how people who are our neighbors are invisibilized and that their voices are ignored. I see some people in the room who live in or around the core of our city. In the last 10 days, going back a few days, 7 people died on the streets, either burned to death or froze to death in encampments. And the city's response to that has been to accelerate the teardown of those encampments according to our encampment strategy, which is basically to identify and displace, rather than find housing that's adequate for people. We have emergency shelters in the city, but they're almost at capacity. And the ones that aren't, a lot of people avoid because it's not safe. I've heard from people in the community who refer to some of the spaces as the snake pit or the pit, and it's where people avoid, and they'd rather be outside if that's the choice. It's really bad, and it's getting worse. And it's been getting worse for years and years. And yet we have politicians, whether it's mayor and council, although I want to shout out Michael Jans for doing awesome work on housing, mayor and council in Edmonton and Calgary and other cities are saying that we believe that housing is a human right. It is a priority for us, but there's only so much we can do. We have to make tough choices. It's not our full responsibility. And we also need to recognize that unless this government's at the table, then we can't be at the table as much, right? So it's like the same old lines that we hear, speaking of slogans, from the right or from centrists, that, there's only so much we can do, but we really care, But what I've seen over the last couple of years when we've been focusing on housing is a lot of that Batman meme thing. I don't know if you guys are into memes or whatever, but pointing at other Batmans, or sorry, Spider-Mans. I'm so old, such a boomer moment. Other Spider-Mans being like, you, no you, no you. And that's what's happening right now through our budget process at the city. And it's so frustrating and unnecessary, right? We need all hands on deck. For example, according to the city's own documents, if we invest in housing, we'll get $4 back for every dollar that we invest in housing. So the other day, you see people from the Urban Development Institute BOMA, the Chambers of Commerce say we really need to count our dollars and make sure that we're catalyzing investment for every dollar. It's like, I couldn't agree more. But there's no better investment at the city budget level than investing in housing. $4 for every dollar, right? So over the last 4-year budget cycle, I think we almost brought back $700 million for our investment from other orders of government and also partners as well. But we need to build thousands upon thousands of units, right? I think what we need to have happen right now is to ask our politicians to put their money where their mouths are when it comes to their values on housing. I had a recent conversation with Mayor Sohi, and he said that housing and climate are his priorities in this budget. So we need everyone to make sure that we're writing our council and making sure that that's a reality. It's not that we don't have the solutions, and I think, Rebecca, you did a really good point of saying that. So I want to focus a little bit more on solutions, though, because I think it's important to re-articulate them. It's complicated, but it's pretty simple when it comes to housing. We need housing stock across the spectrum. We need deep intervention in the market as well, so like deep subsidy, for example, for people who cannot currently afford the housing and they're in housing insecurity and they might end up experiencing houselessness. And we need housing options that go beyond, market rental and home ownership as well. Cooperatives are pretty cool, I think, but that's another conversation. We've started to see the federal government get interested in options across the housing spectrum in their last 2 budget cycles, which is exciting, but we need more of that. And the broader global picture that Rebecca alluded to as well in Ireland, and it's happening across the entire world, is the financialization of housing that we need to combat and really buffer or block ourselves against as much as we can and reverse the tide. We're lucky, we heard Jason Kenney saying, come to Alberta, you can buy a house here. It's only $500,000, not $2 million. That's true today, but it's also inaccessible to so many people. And also, the bad situation that we're seeing elsewhere, especially in the States and in Europe when it comes to the financialization of housing, is happening here in Alberta and definitely in Vancouver and Toronto for sure, right? So you have Blackstone and major investors and individual investors buying up billions and billions of dollars of housing stock, turning it into short-term rentals, turning it into long-term rentals, and without the adequate sort of supply-side controls and interventions in the market by provincial and federal governments, these companies can just jack rents as much as they want. So you have average rents going up in the last year anywhere between 10 and 30 some odd % in major Canadian cities in 1 year. That's unsustainable. So we need to be really, I think, broad-based and aggressive in our policy prescriptions as progressive organizations, not just in terms of garden suites and changing our bylaws to allow people to become landlords, and thinking about densification, which is important, but also like strong aggressive market interventions, right? And more public housing. Look at the city of Vienna, it's a great example. But my point is that we have the solutions, but we need to be bold and aggressive and think about the entire spectrum. At the civic budget level, just to take it down to I have an ask for everyone in the room today, I really need your help, is we need to write to our city council in the city of Edmonton. If you're not from Edmonton, every budget cycle is on the same timeline, and tell them to make housing a priority because it is connected to our ability to receive investment from other orders of government and turn the tide on the housing crisis that we have in Alberta and across Canada right now. So if you want to talk more about our campaign on housing, I'd love to do that. And I'd also encourage people to think about housing as a human right according to the 7 criteria on adequacy. So often when we think about housing, we think about affordability and we think about just basically a safe and dry roof over people's heads, which is a really important start. And I think that's where we're at in Alberta and Canada right now, but there's other aspects of housing that we need to think about when it comes to adequacy and we need to advocate for. But the big problem is that when it comes to the political will, as we all know in this room, if it doesn't pop up to the top 3 issues, it doesn't really get prioritized by political parties. The really cool thing, I think, right now is that we have an opportunity based on what we're hearing from people on the doorsteps and also in the public opinion research is that affordability and economic anxiety is top of mind for a lot of people, and it's connected to housing security as well, whether you're a homeowner or a renter. and whether or not you're really concerned about housing insecurity as the number one issue that might come up. It's true that people are thinking about housing in a way that I think is broader across the spectrum than it has been before, and that is translating into conversations with political leaders about making housing a priority. At the same time, what we're hearing is Batman or Spider-Man pointing at other levels of government and saying, we really care, we've done a lot, but we can't continue to do so much. And then you have the provincial government, where I think Jason Nixon's responsible, but it's not in his title. Jason Nixon is now the housing minister, but he's Jeremy Nixon, thank you, Jeremy Nixon.
Nixon number 2.
Nixon 2. And he is walking around saying, well, we're giving money to the mustard seed. What more do you want, right? Basically. I mean, maybe that's not fair, but I don't really care, to be fair to the UCP, quite frankly.
Yep.
We are nonpartisan, though, as an organization. But it's falling on deaf ears at the provincial level, and so I think our first step is like municipal engagement, getting those municipal dollars, and then being ready to catch all of the investment. And we're so close. And it's going to be a drop in the bucket. It's not, it's a generational opportunity. It's not going to turn the tide overnight, but we have to be ready to be smart about those interventions when those opportunities arise, because it's a 4-year budget cycle. So we're talking about $91 million in capital funding. We're talking about $75 million in operating. And then we're talking about, how that will come back from other orders of government. So it's hundreds of millions of dollars that might be left on the table if we don't get that into the budget. So it kind of sounds boring, but these moments are really, really important to intervene on. So if we're gonna, actually make progress on adequately bringing the right to housing commitment to our communities, we need to make housing a priority. And I would argue, too, that it's so fundamentally connected to our ability to participate in democracy, and to think about other things as well. If you don't have good housing, your ability to participate fully in our civil society is greatly limited. If you look at encampments that are on our streets, if you look at just the sort of visible examples of houselessness and poverty that we're seeing in Edmonton, that's going to get worse, not better, if we follow the logic of neoliberal power brokers who have a lot of influence in the discourse and in city council and at the legislature, who are saying, what we need? We need, they say it quietly, right? Like, it's coded, of course, neoliberalism, but it's like, we need more police, and we need more funds to make sure that we can keep our businesses safe, and we want people to be displaced if they're kind of like in our way. Yeah. And that is unacceptable. And it doesn't have to happen, but we need to make sure that our leaders who say we hold these values actually put them into their budgets. And I think we have a big opportunity to do that. At Public Interest Alberta, I think our number one priority is making sure that we are talking about organizing for power with community as well. So I just want to leave off on sort of the work that we're doing with our partners and with community when it comes to housing, and talking with renters and talking with people who experience homelessness or have experienced homelessness, and people who are doing mutual aid work, because there's a lot of power in storytelling, I believe. I think we've talked a little bit about narrative this weekend, and how in building power, we need to work together to make sure that people who don't normally have access to decision makers, or might not really understand how I can just go talk to my city councilor. It's like, yeah, they want to hear from you. They really, really do. And so I think when housing comes up for me, when I think about narrative and storytelling, the real key to making decision makers really think about the decisions they're making when it comes to moving unfunded to funded packages in the city budget, like whether we build a rec center or we build permanent supportive housing, for example, is making sure that they're looking into the eyes of people who are experiencing this crisis firsthand, because then it's harder to look away. If you want to talk, we have a lot of stuff going on right now. We've had a lot of good conversations with city councilors and the mayor recently. But I'm anxious about what's going to happen in the next 3 weeks. I really am, right? People are saying the right things, but they're also saying, but what about those guys? And right now it's about municipal budgets and making sure that housing is put first. We have a campaign coming up. It's called Housing Now YEG. We wrote to the Journal yesterday, so there's an op-ed that we wrote to the Journal yesterday if you want to check it out. It's about the right to housing. So Housing Now YG is coming up. It's going to be hosted on our website, pialberta.org. So please get engaged. What we're going to be doing is sending a letter from organizations to Mayor and Council. We'll also be having a massive campaign to send letters that we will draft that people can make their own to Mayor and Council as well, to call for investment in capital, operating a washroom strategy for downtown and our core neighborhoods, and also a grant program for permanent supportive housing providers that will be in place in lieu of a tax exemption, so that our permanent supportive housing providers can continue to provide necessary services and also plan to expand their services in the community. So those are our 4 big asks. And also, just call up your city councilor too. I have like a short list of people that I really think could use some attention. We can talk about that over coffee. Housing is a human right. Let's make it a reality. I appreciate all your support and all your advocacy. Cheers.
I'm actually speaking on behalf of one of our fellow HSA board members who's viewing this virtually right now, and she lives in a rural area, and she wanted me to ask, that it always seems to be about the urban centers and what is the vision for like the whole province and housing in some of the more smaller communities.
Thank you for the question. I think when we think about rural and remote areas outside of like our big centers and housing, it's really important that we think about like accessibility to services. I always think about Medicine Hat first and foremost, which I think in 2021, very recently, reached functional zero on chronic houselessness, which is very, well, it's not very technical. It's a technical term that says, it's like 180 days in a year, or, hasn't experienced homelessness, I think 3 or 4 times in a year or something. It's a technical term, but it's an amazing outcome. What they did is they focused on working with service providers, both public and third sector, and making housing first their number 1 strategy, and investing in it really heavily. There are criticisms about how they measure that, and there are obviously still people in that community experiencing houselessness, but they've ended chronic houselessness. When it comes to even smaller communities, I want to work more on with people who are representing those communities and working in those communities. It's sometimes I think when I think about housing, we try to go to where we can make the most impact first. It's so visible in bigger cities, maybe a little bit less so than Calgary or Edmonton, but in Calgary, emergency shelters and that kind of thing. And a lot of people from rural or remote communities, based on what we hear from like frontline service providers and people doing mutual aid, is that people are, coming to Edmonton, Calgary, and our medium-sized cities who are experiencing houselessness or housing insecurity because there are, relatively better or the idea of better access to services. So people from, who don't have a permanent home in Edmonton and Calgary are coming to access those services. So that's part of the reason why, I think our focus has been there. I want to work more on it, and I'd love to connect on it. I think it's important for us to not be overlooking that. We're going to be at Terra Lhasa next week, at their AGM, which is still Edmonton, but it's west. And they were like, we are now seeing encampments in our community for the first time. And I imagine that's very true in small and rural communities as well, or visible signs of housing insecurity. So
I am Brett Lambert. I am Research Officer for the Edmonton Social Planning Council. I promise I'm not a plant for Bradley. We do work with Public Interest Alberta on child poverty issues and things like that. A little bit of a shameless plug. Our organization does do a good amount of research when it comes to these housing issues. So I guess within the last few years alone, we've done projects about how do you do good community engagement to counter neighborhood opposition to affordable housing developments going up, how people who are on years-long wait lists to receive rental assistance, what the impacts are there, and the recommendations of how you go forward. I don't know how many copies are still at my table outside, but the fact that I'm running out is probably a good sign. I think there's this big tension when we talk about housing, is that, so on the one hand we are talking about the human right, but it's also the way our society works. We've got a lot of it treating it as a commodity, so obviously home ownership, it's kind of a way people have built equity and wealth and all that. Those two kind of tension is huge. It feels very hard to have both existing. So I guess, do you have thoughts, Brad, about how do we actually shift it to seeing it more as a social good? So I'm not necessarily saying, abolish all home ownership, You know, I know I'm a homeowner, so I guess I'm guilty. But it's very clear we need to carve out more space for the social good part. I guess write that balance correctly. Thoughts about how we get there beyond, you know, bugging Michael Jans to do something, you know.
When it comes to interventions in the market, to me, there are really relatively aggressive and smart interventions we can make in the housing market before we start taking away Brett and Brad's homes or mortgages. And I know you're not really saying that, but in getting at like the conversation about those interventions, I think that we can talk about where my mind goes is REITs, real estate investment trusts. And I think about the distortion of the market that those have had in the Canadian market, and even more so elsewhere. And also short-term rentals and Airbnb. How many homes in, especially Toronto and Vancouver, but other mid-sized cities in Canada, are either vacant or reserved for short-term rentals that are distorting the real estate market that, you know, could be regulated by municipalities. They have those powers. Toronto has been wrestling with it for years, even though Airbnb has very intense lobbyists. So those are two ideas that I have before we start thinking about, you know, because it is true, you know, households obviously invest in real estate as well as a way to, you know, increase, you know, equity and asset. But, you know, I think there's other ways we can get at the big bad guys before we start talking about housing. And the other thing, just really quickly, I'd say is like, we have a lot of housing need that isn't going to be met by the market or people's ability to access it right now. To me, social housing, like renovating the Alberta Social Housing Corporation in the next term or two of a progressive government, we used to build housing and operate it directly, provincially. That corporation still exists. Crown corporations, like, let's renovate that, you know? We used to know how to do it. Let's do it again.
There's a big sort of unanswered question in the room, which is why middle-class Canadians, or those aspiring to reach it, would like to place all of their future financial hopes on home ownership. Why are we channeled into clinging on to the equity in our home and hoping that house prices triple before we retire? That's a systemic problem, that our retirement hopes and our ability to fund our long-term care place has to do with what we sell our house for in our 60s or 70s. So there's a huge problem there. But secondly, I think your question about narratively shifting people's conceptions of housing from commodity to human right. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that they're necessarily opposed, but I think some, like, the storytelling that Brad's talking about emphasizing to people the sort of hidden tragedies of houselessness. CBC had a story just this week about a Shigella outbreak in encampments here. Some people here are familiar with this. It's a bacterial infection. It's hygiene related. People aren't able to wash, take care of themselves, and it's completely physically debilitating. You're in those conditions, you can't even access health care to get treatment for this. Then you think about political decisions, like our current government, who for a very long time made it very difficult for doctors to bill for what they call good faith healthcare provision. It means offering healthcare services for people who might not have an Alberta healthcare card, they don't have proper ID or a fixed address. Political decisions constraining those things, saying, well, this should be the work of charity or the work of police or the work of somebody, is saying that your fundamental access to hygiene and cleanliness and health, treatment for a condition you've picked up through no fault of your own kind of thing, right? So I think that's where maybe emphasizing those linkages and saying at the moment, the solution to that particular problem was one doctor working with an organization to create temporary housing, simply so that his houseless patients could have an address to be discharged to. So instead of these individuals feeling that they have to create these things from scratch, and as Brad points out, we had templates for these as societies. Other places have templates. Northern Ireland, pre-Troubles, had public housing. There was a lot broken with the system, but they had public housing.
I was a home care nurse for many years, went into a lot of Greater Edmonton Foundation buildings, and they were cheap housing for seniors. The buildings were very clean and very well maintained, and it was only a third of your income, whatever it was. You put in your tax forms, and if you only got $1,000 a month, you only paid $300. I think a strategy like that could help, but they were only for seniors, but why not have them for all ages and for families? And something like a greater Edmonton Foundation model.
I'll just say I fully agree. Absolutely. We should do that. And have a very strict definition about what affordable housing is, because right now it's 10 to 15% below market, according to a lot of institutions and governments. 30% or less of your income is much better, and there's other ways we need to think about affordability, for sure.
I worked in mental health and addictions, and my last 10 years was spent in housing, mental health, and addiction issues and the homeless. And it was a crisis like in 2008. And money was poured in by the governments, by the federal governments, and look where we are now. Shame on us. Shame on us as citizens, because again, it's not in my backyard, so I don't have to deal with that. I go through the inner city on a once, twice a week basis, and it brings tears to my eyes to see those encampments again and to hear the stories and say, what the F is going on here? Why haven't we done anything about it? We fight amongst each other. So I asked at the Right at Home board, what's going on? And we're in competition with each other. We're all trying to get that little bit of money from the federal government, from the provincial government. And if you want to see an uprising of a movement, a housing movement is what we need in this province, in this Edmonton. And then a plug. The Edmonton Coalition to End Housing is having a seminar on housing and day, the 22nd at Garneau Hall. So anybody that can come there, go online and look it up, because again, we need the movement. Thank you.
It seems that an overarching issue we have to address and still combat is the phenomenon of neoliberalism, neoliberal globalization, because this affordable housing or housing crisis is a global crisis. It's not in our backyard. We're part of a much larger problem. The question I'd like to address, and I think that just housing per se is not sufficient. It has to be supported by other social infrastructure, health, education, libraries, and very importantly, I would say, the environment. A study was conducted here at the University of Alberta indicates there's a 6 to 12 degrees centigrade difference between temperature in Edmonton versus outside, and where those heat zones are in fact poor areas. So an environment is part of a justice issue. I just wonder if you could speak more holistically about all these other parts of the infrastructure, social infrastructure, and the environment, if we're going to have good, healthy housing that people are proud of, not stigmatized, and lasts a long time.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think, first of all, coming back to again and again, like where are those political choices happening? Who's influencing, who's having those conversations, and how do we shift them? I think it's important to remember that it's not just that this was some economic theory, but that this was, particularly for Margaret Thatcher, the shift toward a neoliberalism and the primacy of market forces was about fundamentally reconfiguring British society for her. The ripple effects that had across Western society towards a more fragmented sort of society where those social safety nets that were such a key part of the post-war rebuilding, the welfare state in Britain, in the UK, that was called the Beveridge model after its founder there, right? So all of these pieces were about rethinking our society to put the well-being of humans first. Housing, healthcare, education as the pillars of that. And once you come into that agenda where you dismantle and pull those things apart, you also pull apart those connections, not just as a safety net for people, but as community and as connection. So I think that's so important to think about how those fit together and what do we want for each other in the future, and then to think about how do we make that happen.
On the how we make it happen, some of the things that come to mind when we're talking about environment and habitability, and that's one of the criteria of adequate housing according to the UN, so it's floating up here in the universe, but how we ground it is we now have a federal housing advocate that was appointed through legislation that was passed, I think, in 2019, the National Housing Strategy Act, I believe. And then, the Affordable Housing Solutions Lab here at the U of A that I'm part of with Dr. Joshua Evans is thinking about environment and habitability in an Edmonton context specifically and in Alberta, because you're right. I mean, I just full-heartedly agree. It's so important to think about how housing is connected to so many other issues, even social and community health, right? Like connection to other people, isolation and loneliness. When you think about certain people who, like seniors and other communities of people, it's like you have to think about this holistically. It's very important. We're starting to see that grounding happen in the last 5 years in Canada, but there's a lot of work to do. Like Toronto's thinking about, being a right to housing city. Maybe Edmonton and Calgary need to do that and ground it. And then the bylaws and policies that we see come up at council will be informed by that, that lens or whatever. But it's just, there's a ton of work to do on that. And yeah.
I can write my city councillor, but I can also, walk and chew gum at the same time. And one of the things we see happening across all social services is a block in Conservative premiers actually implementing funding they're getting from the federal government. So they're leaving a lot of money on the table when it comes to housing, when it comes to healthcare. So what are your solutions for addressing some of these blockages? So yes, I can take action locally, but what should we be doing at a federal level to address these Conservative premiers?
A little bit to your question there, I think when you think about how all of these pieces fit together that maybe at the time seemed very disparate, I see Jack Lucas in the audience who might have something to say about this too, about the way in which the UCP binned the agenda for big city charters, which was something that the mayors and councils for Edmonton and Calgary had been working on for over a decade, I think, to develop that kind of autonomy to be able to engage more directly outside of this like hierarchy between like federal, provincial, city, and to address some of those needs in different ways and to have that flexibility financially, but also in terms of that intergovernmental relationship. So it's interesting that that's one of the very first things that went in the garbage under the UCP for precisely some of these reasons, right? So I don't know the answer to how to get around that necessarily, but just to say that, yes, there was an avenue there, and that was closed down for reasons. More direct solution, where I always come through, is on the left in particular for the last few years have been reluctant to get in the streets. There have been a lot of rallies. There have been a lot of like very polite, very well organized, very well informed meetings at the legislature fountains, and I wholeheartedly support those. And I think that's important to be visible in that way. But I also think there has to be a certain point where people start taking direct action collectively to say, we're aware of how this is working. We're aware that our provincial government is shutting down these avenues for us, and we're going to create our own. And we start to look at CUPE in Ontario, and that's a particular situation, but I think they're setting an example for us to say, we're going to come to certain lines in the sand, and how we want to take those actions in a peaceful manner, but certainly a very strident and persistent one. And it might have to be really direct and really visible.
In the interest of chewing gum and walking at the same time, we need to be organizing for change politically, electorally in this province, at the same time that we're advocating for investments in housing at all orders of government. When it comes to leveraging housing dollars specifically, the federal government has realized that they need to get back in the housing game after, Paul Martin left it, a little by little. And so you have the Rapid Housing Initiative and other aspects of programming through the budget that are accessible to municipalities with or without provincial dollars. But it is even less of a drop in the bucket as a result of that. Shame sometimes works as a strategy and tactic, like Deanna. I don't know, like with the childcare movement coming together with Morna and others, and Donna, the province signed on to that deal ultimately, and they're trying to get as much away with as they can when it comes to making it Alberta-based and not as great as it should be. But they got the dollars flowing through. It meant a lot of reductions in fees for a lot of families. So I think that there's an opportunity here on housing in the next few months to shame Jeremy Nixon and maybe his brother too, I don't know, with a strategy,
All of
but
them. All the Nixons.
and again, we are nonpartisan, but organizing for change needs to be a big part of it, and I think that there's only so much we can do. However, at City Council, like with Michael Jans and his colleagues, is that like we have to be ready to catch those dollars if and when they come through, and no matter how much they are. And we can't be ready to do that unless we have maximum investment now through our municipal budgets. But yeah, also thinking long-term is really important too.
And just to say, aside from taking to the streets, which I appreciate in the context of my allegory to Northern Ireland and my mention of Molotov cocktails, may have sounded like I was suggesting something that I wasn't. So just to be really clear on that. But I also think supporting groups like Friends of Medicare, supporting groups like the Canadian Health Coalition, who are putting those pressures federally as well. For example, to have the federal health minister work around intransigent premiers and to make side deals with individual provinces that are willing to work towards common healthcare goals rather than giving funding with no strings attached, right? So that's going to take time, but I think putting that pressure in the same sort of tactic as the childcare approach might be fruitful as well. So support those federal organizations that are pushing the message.
Can we give one more round of applause to our two great panelists who have a little gift for those? Surprise, surprise.